What if I told you that long before Rome ruled the Mediterranean, there was another empire wealthier, more cunning, and feared by every sailor who crossed its waters? And what if that empire vanished, not because it was conquered in battle, but because it was erased, systematically, brutally, from the memory of mankind? This is the untold story of the Carthaginian Empire, a civilization born from trade, built on the sea, and destroyed in fire. Imagine standing on the cliffs of North Africa, the wind from the Mediterranean whipping your face as the faint sound of bronze triremes echoes from the past. This was once the heart of an empire that commanded oceans, invented new ways of commerce, and rivaled Rome itself. But how did a merchant city become a superpower? And how did that same city become so hated, so feared, that Rome swore an oath to salt its very earth? Over the next chapters, we'll travel through the golden age of Carthage, its rise from a Phoenician outpost to the master of Mediterranean trade, its clashes with the greatest generals of its age, and the haunting shadow of Rome that would one day bring it all to ruin. The founding flames of Carthage. Have you ever stood by the sea and felt it whisper secrets from another age? Imagine waves that once carried not tourists or fishermen, but the dreams of an empire. It all began with a runaway princess, a curse, and a spark that would one day ignite Rome's greatest fear. The year was around 814 BCE. The Mediterranean shimmered under a Phoenician sun, where the great city of Tyre, modern-day Lebanon, buzzed with the hum of trade and the scent of cedar. Ships came and went, heavy with glass, ivory, and purple dye, the color of kings. But behind those golden walls, a story of betrayal brewed, a story that would give birth to Carthage. Princess Alyssa, known to history as Dido, fled her homeland after her brother, King Pygmalion, murdered her husband for gold. She escaped with a band of loyal Tyrians, sailing west across waters unknown. Days turned into weeks, storms tore at their sails, but Dido refused to yield. Her eyes, cold, determined, unblinking, stared toward the horizon. Somewhere out there, she would build a new home. When they landed on the North African coast, the land belonged to the Berber king, Irbas. Dido asked only for as much land as could be covered by an ox hide. Amused, the king agreed. But Dido was clever. She sliced the hide into thin strips, long enough to encircle a vast hill by the sea. Byrsa hill, where the first walls of Carthage rose. What began as an exile's cunning bargain became the foundation of an empire. From the start, Carthage's destiny was tied to the sea. The Phoenicians were born sailors, and their descendants would inherit that mastery tenfold. Wooden docks stretched into blue waters, triremes creaked under the weight of bronze armor, and the harbor grew into a marvel of engineering, a double ring of docks, one for trade, one for war, perfectly hidden from the eyes of rivals. It was said that even in calm weather, the harbor hummed like a living thing. Trade was Carthage's heartbeat. From the silver mines of Iberia to the tin-rich shores of Britain, Carthaginian ships carried goods farther than anyone had before. They traded with Egypt, Sicily, Greece, even the mysterious tribes beyond the Pillars of Hercules. Their merchants weren't mere traders, they were explorers, diplomats, and spies rolled into one. Wherever they went, they bought, sold, and learned. But beneath that prosperity lay something darker, ruthless instinct to dominate the seas. Carthage didn't just trade, it controlled. Rival ports that refused its terms found themselves blockaded. Captains who crossed them vanished into the deep. Slowly, the Mediterranean became their domain. Greek writers would later call it the Mare, Punic Sea. Yet, Carthage's wealth brought envy. The Greeks whispered of its greed. Others spoke of strange rituals, of sacrifices to gods with flaming hands, of drums that drowned the cries of children. Whether myth or propaganda, such stories painted Carthage as both exotic and sinister. And maybe that was part of its power. Mystery protected the city as much as its fleet. For over 2 centuries, Carthage thrived. Its purple sails became a symbol of dominance, and its coin bore the image of the goddess Tennet, serene yet commanding, as if watching over the empire's fate. But the sea that had given Carthage life was also drawing her closer to her greatest rival, the land hungry, iron-hearted republic, rising from the Italian peninsula. Rome. It began quietly, almost innocently, with trade disputes in Sicily. The island sat in the middle of everything, the crossroads of east and west. To control Sicily was to control the Mediterranean. Carthage had long held influence there, but Rome, newly ambitious, wanted in. Tension thickened. Two young powers stared at each other across the strait, both claiming they wanted peace, both preparing for war. Before we reach that clash, we must understand what made Carthage so formidably and so feared. Carthage was not an empire of farmers or philosophers. It was an empire of merchants, but merchants who thought like generals. Every trade route was a battlefront, every harbor, a fortress. They didn't build massive stone armies like the Egyptians, or sprawling legions like the Romans. Instead, they built network sciences, bought with gold, loyalty secured with contracts, not oaths. Money was their weapon, and it worked. But when money failed, mercenaries took over. Carthage rarely used its own citizens in war. Instead, it hired the best soldiers money could buy. Iberians with curved swords, Numidian cavalry, swift as desert wind, and Libyan spearmen who fought with disciplined fury. These men didn't fight for love of Carthage, they fought for pay. And that gave the Carthaginian generals a strange kind of freedom. War was business, just like trade. Among these generals rose one man whose name would echo through history: Hamilcar Barca, a brilliant commander, cunning as the city that birthed him. He believed Carthage had grown complacent, too dependent on trade, too soft. When Carthage lost the First Punic War to Roma, defeat that cost them, Sicily and Pride, Hamilcar swore vengeance. He turned his gaze to Spain, a land rich in metals and men, and began building a new army, one that would one day march on Rome itself. But that, as you'll soon see, was merely the beginning of a blood oath. Still, back in Carthage, the people celebrated prosperity. The city was beautiful. Its whitewashed walls glowed under the sun. Temples rose in marble and gold, and the scent of frankincense filled the air. Carthaginian art depicted ships, elephants, and gods with almond eyes. Its senate, composed of merchant princes, debated endlessly but always returned to one goal: profit. And yet, beneath that surface of wealth, cracks began to show. The reliance on foreign mercenaries bred mistrust. The common citizens, rarely involved in politics or war, grew detached. Carthage's power, once rooted in unity, now rested on contracts and coin. When the mercenaries returned from the First Punic War unpaid, they revolted. The result was one of the bloodiest internal wars in ancient history, the Mercenary War. For 3 years, Carthage burned from within. Towns turned on each other. The mercenaries, enraged and betrayed, massacred civilians. In response, Carthage unleashed brutal reprisals. It was said that entire cities were crucified: men, women, and even their leaders nailed to crosses that lined the roads. When the smoke cleared, Carthage had survived, but at a terrible cost. It had learned to fear its own army. Still, out of that chaos rose Hamilcar Barca's legacy. His son Hannibal was only a boy, but he was already watching, learning, and remembering. According to legend, before his father set out for Spain, he took Hannibal to the temple of Baal Hamon and made him swear an oath, never to be a friend of Rome. The boy placed his small hand upon the sacred altar and swore that moment would shape the destiny of nations. But for now, Carthage's focus turned outward again, its eyes fixed on Spain, rich in gold and silver, filled with tribes eager for alliance or conquest. It was the perfect place to rebuild. Hamilcar marched his forces across the land, winning battles and hearts alike. He founded New Carthage, Cartagena, mirror of the great city back home. It was both a fortress and a treasure chest, the seed of a second empire. And yet, even as Carthage rose again, Rome watched from across the sea, uneasy. The two powers were like storm clouds drifting toward each other, destined to collide. Every move one made, the other countered. When Carthage signed treaties, Rome signed alliances. When Rome sent legions, Carthage sent fleets. It wasn't yet open war, but it was coming by the time Hamilcar died in battle. His son Hannibal had already inherited more than an army. He inherited his father's hatred, his vision, and his war. The boy who swore an oath to destroy Rome would soon rise to fulfill it. Leading an army across mountains, thought impassable, striking fear into the heart of the Republic itself. But before that storm breaks, Let us return to the city that started it, all the jewel of North Africa, the mistress of the sea, because Carthage itself was changing. Its temples grew taller, its gold more plentiful, but its spirit, its fire had begun to dim. The senators grew cautious, the merchants grew greedy, and somewhere in that glittering wealth, the defiant spark of Dido's courage flickered low. The sea, that had once carried their fortune, now carried omens. Roman ships patrolled the western waters. The winds that once smelled of spice and cedar now brought the iron scent of war. And somewhere far to the north, a young Roman general was being told of a name he would never forget: Hannibal Barca. The story of Carthage was no longer just about trade, or triremes, or temples. It was about burning vengeance that would soon turn the world to fire. And as the Mediterranean waited, holding its breath, the first thunder of hoofbeats echoed from across the Pyrenees. Hannibal's oath, the boy who promised to burn. ROM, have you ever seen a storm before it breaks? When the sky goes silent, and you can almost feel the world holding its breath. That's what the Mediterranean felt like when a boy named Hannibal Barca grew into a man. Because everyone, Romans, Carthaginians, allies, enemies, knew that something unstoppable was coming. The oath had been sworn in blood and fire. Hannibal, barely 9 years old, stood before the god Baal-Haman, his hand on the sacred altar. His father, Hamilcar Barca, the great general who had rebuilt Carthage's power in Spain, watched him with pride and purpose. The boy's voice trembled, but his eyes didn't. "I swear," he said, "never to be a friend of Rome." From that moment, his life became an inheritance of hatred. To the Romans, Carthage was a defeated enemy. To Hannibal, Rome was a shadow that had stolen his father's victory, a thief that needed to be punished. And so, under the burning sun of Iberia, Hannibal grew hardened by campaigns, trained by the same soldiers who had once fought under Hamilcar's banners. When Hamilcar died in battle, the command passed to his son-in-law Hasdrubal the Fair, who ruled Spain not by war, but by diplomacy. He expanded Carthage's influence through treaties and marriages, securing alliances with native tribes. But Rome, ever watchful, demanded limits. A treaty was signed. Carthage would not cross the river Ebro, beyond that Rome claimed dominion. It was meant to keep peace. Instead, it drew a line Hannibal would one day cross, when Hasdrubal was assassinated by a local chieftain. Carthage's soldiers looked to Hannibal, young, fierce, and already beloved by the army. The soldiers cried his name, and the Senate of Carthage, far and away across the sea, agreed. The boy who had sworn an oath became commander of Spain's armies. From the moment he took command, Hannibal moved with purpose. He studied the enemy not as an abstraction but as prey. He knew Roman habits, their pride, their rigid command structure. Where Rome was slow and deliberate, Hannibal was fluid, unpredictable. He began by securing loyalty among the Iberian tribes through gold when possible, through fear when necessary. But his eyes were already set beyond the horizon toward Saguntum, a city allied with Rome, lying south of the Ebro. It was Carthaginian territory by treaty, but Roman protection by promise. It was the spark waiting for flame. Hannibal laid siege to Saguntum. The city's defenders sent pleas to Rome, but the Senate delayed. They debated, hesitated, waited too long. For 8 brutal months, Hannibal's engines battered Saguntum's walls. His troops fought in streets slick with blood, until finally, the city fell. Every surviving inhabitant was sold into slavery. The message was clear. Carthage was done kneeling. When news reached Rome, senators stood in stunned silence. Some demanded immediate war. Others counseled patience. But a Roman embassy soon sailed to Carthage, and standing before the Senate, the Roman envoy gathered his toga into a fold and held it high. "In this," he said, "I carry peace and war. Choose which you will." The Carthaginian council hesitated, debating profit and politics as always. But the voice of the people, still nursing their old hatred, rose in one united cry: war. And so, the Second Punic War began. But Hannibal was not a man who waited for his enemy. Rome expected him to defend Spain, or sail for Italy's shores. Instead, he chose the impossible and audacious, near-mad plan that even his generals called suicide. He would march his army, tens of thousands of men, horses, and war elephants over the towering, snow-drenched Alps and strike Rome from the north. No one had ever done it before. No one thought it could be done. The journey began in the spring of 218 BCE from New Carthage. His army moved through Iberia, fighting tribes that tried to block their path, crossing rivers swollen with mountain melt. They reached the Pyrenees, then the Rhine. Behind them, Carthaginian supply lines stretched thin. Ahead, the Alps rose like jagged teeth. Imagine the scene. The air thin and cruel, snow falling like ash, elephants trumpeting in terror on narrow mountain paths, soldiers shivering, their feet bleeding on frozen rock. Roman spies, watching from afar, refused to believe it. They thought the Alps would destroy him. But Hannibal was relentless. He inspired his men not with words, but with presence, eating what they ate, sleeping among them, fighting beside them when the tribes attacked. They lost nearly half their army in that crossing, frozen, starved, buried beneath avalanches, but those who survived emerged into Italy like ghosts from another world. The Romans never saw them coming. And what came out of those mountains wasn't an army. It was vengeance incarnate. The first encounter came at the river Ticinus. The Roman cavalry charged, confident and proud. They had no idea what kind of enemy they faced. Hannibal's Numidian horsemen, masters of feigned retreats, lured them into a trap and cut them down. Soon after came the Battle of the Trebia. In icy water up to their chests, Roman soldiers waded into ambush. Hannibal's men slaughtered them in the freezing cold, their shouts echoing off the riverbanks. Rome was stunned. To defeat swift and total. But Hannibal wasn't done. He wanted to crush not just Rome's armies, but its spirit. Winter came, but Hannibal's army did not rest. They foraged, raided, and survived among the Italian people. Many of Rome's allies, inspired by his victories, began to waver. Carthage, far away, watched with awe and fear. Their general had done the impossible, but he was deep in enemy land, cut off from home, sustained only by cunning and courage. Then came the spring of 217 BCE, on the Battle of Lake Trasimene. Hannibal found a narrow valley shrouded in mist, the lake to one side, hills to the other. He hid his troops among the slopes and waited. As the Roman column marched unsuspectingly along the shore, Hannibal gave the signal. The trap closed like a vice. Thousands of Romans were cut down before they could even draw their swords. The lake turned red with their blood. It was the largest ambush in history, and when word reached Rome, panic erupted. Shops closed. Senators fled. Mothers wept in the streets. Yet Hannibal did not march on the city. Not yet. He wanted to destroy Rome, piece by piece, to unravel its alliances, to bleed it dry. His victories were not just military, they were psychological. Every battle whispered the same message. Rome is not invincible. But Rome would not die easily. The Senate, desperate, appointed a new leader, Quintus Fabius Maximus, the Cunctator, the delayer. Fabius refused to meet Hannibal in open battle. He shadowed the Carthaginian army, harassed their foragers, burned crops ahead of them. He turned avoidance into a strategy. And for the first time Hannibal's advance slowed. Carthage's Senate, impatient for glory, sent little support. Hannibal's soldiers grew restless. Supplies ran low, and yet, his mind never ceased to weave plans. He struck where no one expected, appearing in places no one thought possible. He crossed mountain passes, ravaged southern Italy, and kept Rome terrified. Then, in 216 BCE, came the climax, the moment that would make his name immortal. The Battle of Cannae. 80,000 Roman soldiers, nearly the entire consular army, marched to annihilate Hannibal once and for all. He commanded barely half that number. The battlefield stretched across the Apulian plains, hot and dusty. Hannibal arranged his troops in a crescent formation, his weaker infantry at the center, his strongest on the flanks. When the Romans charged, they drove the center back, believing they had broken through. But Hannibal's line bent, not broke. His wings folded inward like jaws. As the Roman legionaries pressed forward, they found themselves surrounded, hemmed in so tightly they couldn't lift their swords. It was slaughter. Nearly 50,000 Romans died in a single day. The Republic's consuls were killed, its legions annihilated. Cannae became a word that chilled the Roman soul. Afterward, Rome's allies trembled. Cities defected to Hannibal's side. The Italian south opened its gates to him. It seemed as if Rome's end had come, and yet he hesitated, standing amid the field of corpses. His chief officer, Maharbel, urged him, "Send me ahead with the cavalry, and within 5 days you will dine in the capital." Hannibal's reply was calm. "You know how to win a victory, Maharbel, but not how to use it." That hesitation born of caution, or exhaustion, or the realization that Rome was a beast that could not die easily, would haunt him forever. Because while Hannibal celebrated, Rome did not surrender. It rebuilt. It bled, but it learned. The Republic turned its losses into resolve, and its fear into fire. Back in Carthage, the Senate argued again, divided between merchants counting profits and generals counting corpses. They sent little aid. Hannibal's pleas went unanswered. He was alone in the heart of Italy, a shadow haunting Roman soil, victorious yet stranded. The war that had begun with a boy's oath was far from over. The tide had turned once already. It could turn again. And as Rome began to evolve, a new figure was Razinga, young general, who would one day march against Hannibal himself, not in Italy, but on the very soil of Africa. The hunter was about to become the hunted. The lion and the wolf, Scipio, RISS, have you ever noticed that history's greatest rivalries aren't between equals at the start, but between hunter and prey, predator and survivor, each transforming the other? Hannibal had become a legend, the ghost that haunted Rome's nightmares. But Rome, wounded and humiliated, was evolving into something new, something far more dangerous. And at the center of that transformation stood a young man named Publius Cornelius Scipio. When Scipio first heard of Hannibal's victories, he was only in his late teens. He had been present at the disastrous Battle of the Tribia, where his father, also named Publius, barely escaped alive. It was there that young Scipio saved him, cutting through enemy lines to rescue his wounded father from Numidian riders. Some say that in that moment, standing amid the chaos of defeat, the future conqueror of Carthage was born. Rome needed men who could think like Hannibal, men who could adapt, deceive, and strike. Scipio watched, learned, and waited. While older generals feared the Carthaginian, Scipio studied him. He learned the art of movement, of ambush, of psychological war. He understood that to defeat Hannibal, Rome would have to become what it despised: flexible, cunning, ruthless. But in those early years, the Republic teetered on the edge of ruin. After Cannae, entire regions of Italy defected. Capua, the jewel of the south, joined Hannibal. Macedon allied with Carthage. Even Sicily smoldered in revolt. Yet Hannibal, despite victory after victory, could not force Rome's gates open. Inside the Senate, despair battled pride. Some senators whispered of negotiation, but one man, Marcus Fabius Maximus the Delayer, stood firm. "No talks," he said. "No peace. Rome must fight on." And Rome obeyed. They conscripted new armies, trained new soldiers, even lowered the age of recruitment. They turned citizens into soldiers, and soldiers into fanatics. Hannibal's campaign entered its long, grinding phase, a war of attrition, in a land that refused to die. The Carthaginian general moved like smoke, appearing suddenly, striking hard, and vanishing into the hills. For 15 years, he ravaged Italy in exile, in the land he sought to conquer. His victories glittering like coins spent too soon. Meanwhile, across the sea, Scipio was carving his own legend. In 211 BCE, Rome faced disaster in Spain. Hannibal's brothers, Hasdrubal and Mago, had swept through Iberia, killing both Roman commanders there. It seemed the Barca family would soon unite Spain under Carthage again. Rome sent a new commander, barely 24 years old, to replace the fallen generals. That commander was Scipio. When Scipio arrived, the soldiers mocked him. "A boy," they said. "A senator's son playing at war." But the young Roman quickly silenced him, not with speeches, but with vision. He studied the terrain, the enemy, the morale of his men. Then he did something Rome rarely did. He took a risk. At dawn, under the cover of sea mist, Scipio launched a surprise assault on New Carthage, the heart of Carthaginian power in Spain. The city was thought impregnable, surrounded by walls and water. Hannibal's brother Mago laughed when he heard the Romans were coming until the impossible happened. Scipio's men waded through a shallow lagoon that locals said was too deep to cross. The morning tide had receded, and under that brief window of nature's mercy, the Romans stormed the walls. By noon, New Carthage was his. Inside its gates, he captured not just treasure and hostages, but Hannibal's secret armory, his engineers, and his morale. The victory stunned both sides. Rome saw a miracle. Carthage saw a new kind of enemy, one who fought with Hannibal's boldness, but Rome's discipline. Scipio treated captives with mercy, earning loyalty instead of resentment. Spanish tribes began to defect to him, swearing allegiance not out of fear, but admiration. The balance was shifting. In the years that followed, Scipio continued to dismantle Carthage's power in Spain. At Becula, he ambushed Hasdrubal, forcing him to retreat north. Then, at Ilipa, he used deception to crush the Carthaginian forces, outright feigning weakness, luring the enemy into complacency. Then reversing his line mid-battle in a maneuver so brilliant that even modern generals still study it. When the dust settled, Carthage had lost Spain forever. Its mines, its men, its wealth all gone. Scipio had struck the empire's purse before touching its heart. Hannibal, isolated in Italy, now stood alone. But the most fateful moment came when Scipio captured Hasdrubal's messengers carrying letters meant for Hannibal. The message told of reinforcements, of an army marching from Spain to Italy. Scipio intercepted it, and at the Battle of the Metaurus, the Romans ambushed Hasdrubal before he could reach his brother. When the battle was over, they found Hasdrubal's headless corpse among the slain. The Romans, cruel in triumph, sent his severed head to Hannibal's camp and hurled it before the general's tent. Hannibal stared at it silently. Witnesses said he didn't speak for hours. At last, he murmured, "I recognize my brother's fate." It was the first time in his life that Hannibal looked beaten. Rome could feel the shift. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, hope returned. Scipio was hailed as a savior. The Senate offered him command, but there was debate. Some feared his ambition, others his youth. But Scipio argued that the only way to end the war was not by chasing Hannibal through Italy, but by striking Carthage itself. The plan was bold, even reckless. Sail to Africa, force Carthage to recall Hannibal, and destroy him on his own soil. Many senators protested, calling it madness. Scipio simply replied, "If we wait, Hannibal will come for us again. If we act, we end this war forever." And so, with the Senate's reluctant approval, he began preparing for invasion. Meanwhile, back in Carthage, fear rippled through the council. Reports from Spain spoke of catastrophe. The Senate, long divided between cautious merchants and ambitious generals, began to fracture completely. They sent pleas to Hannibal recall, defend the homeland. The city that had once ruled the seas now trembled behind its own walls. Hannibal obeyed. After 16 years in Italy, he gathered the remnants of his army battle. Hardened but wary, and began the long, bitter journey home. As his ships crossed the Mediterranean, he looked back one last time toward the Italian coast, where so many of his dreams lay buried. When he landed in Africa, Carthage erupted in hope. The lion had returned. Streets filled with cheering crowds, the air thick with incense and triumph. But beneath that celebration, there was fear. Hannibal was no longer fighting the Rome of his youth. He was facing a Rome that had become his reflection, a Rome forged in his image. The inevitable collision approached. Hannibal met Scipio near the plains of Zama in 202 BCE. Before the battle, the two generals' mirror images of genius met, face to face. No swords, no armies, just words. Hannibal, aged and calm, spoke first. "You are young, Scipio, and fortune has favored you. Let us not tempt her further. End this war now. Let each keep what he has won." Scipio replied, steady and composed, "You know as well as I, Hannibal, that peace without victory is but a truce before another war." The two men parted without agreement. The next day, their armies clashed in the dust of Zama. Hannibal had his war elephants. Scipio had his reformed legions. The elephants charged, but Scipio had planned for it. He opened lanes in his ranks, letting the beasts thunder harmlessly through, before his cavalry struck from behind. The once invincible Carthaginian army crumbled. Hannibal fought fiercely to the end, but the tide had turned. His mercenaries broke. His veterans died around him. And when it was done, Carthage lay defeated, its power shattered forever. Hannibal escaped the field alive. Scipio, now hailed as Scipio Africanus, returned to Rome in triumph. Bells rang, torches burned, the Republic rejoiced. But even in victory, there was unease, because they all knew, men like Hannibal do not vanish. They wait. Back in Carthage, stripped of empire and wealth, the city survived, but only barely. Rome imposed crushing reparations, took its fleet, its territories, its pride, and somewhere in exile, the old general brooded, still dreaming of vengeance. The lion had been wounded, but the fire had not gone out, and as Rome rose to dominate the Mediterranean, the shadow of Carthage lingered quiet, patient, and still watching, because empires fall not in battles, but in whispers. Ashes of the Phoenix. The last stand of Carthage. Have you ever watched a fire that refuses to die, a faint red glow under the ashes, waiting for one breath of wind to rise again? That was Carthage after Zama, broken, humiliated, stripped of empire, yet alive, and as long as it lived, Rome could never rest easy. The peace that followed the Second Punic War wasn't peace, it was strangulation. Rome imposed impossible terms. Carthage had to pay thousands of talents of silver in reparations, year after year, for half a century. Its navy was dismantled, its overseas colonies seized, even its soldiers were forbidden to march beyond its own walls. Carthage, once queen of the sea, became a prisoner of land and fear. And yet somehow it adapted. Trade returned first. Carthaginian merchants, ingenious as ever, found new routes, new goods, new ways to turn Roman restrictions into opportunity. The city's harbors filled again with ships, though they flew no war banners now. Its markets overflowed with grain, ivory, and purple dye. The people who had once built an empire from nothing began rebuilding their pride from dust. Rome watched all of this with wary eyes. To the Romans, Carthage was not a defeated rival, it was a wound that could reopen. And to the Roman senator, Cato the Elder, that wound festered with danger. Every speech he gave, regardless of topic, ended the same way: Carthage must be destroyed. At first, people laughed. The war was long past. Hannibal himself was gone, an exile fleeing from kingdom to kingdom, hunted by Roman agents until he finally took his own life rather than fall into their hands. Surely, they said, Carthage posed no threat, but Cato would not let them forget. He had seen the city's wealth return. The fields bloom again, the merchant ships growing sleek and plentiful. They have not changed, he warned. They trade now, instead of fight, but trade brings gold, and gold buys swords. And he was right, in a way. The more Rome demanded, the more Carthage resisted quietly, rebuilding not its armies, but its spirit. The Senate, that had once cowered under Roman command, now debated openly, cautiously, about independence. And far to the south, Carthage began to clash with its old rivals, the Numidians. Rome's favored allies, the Numidian king, Massinissa, had fought beside Scipio at Zama. Rome had rewarded him with vast lands that once belonged to Carthage. But Massinissa was greedy. Year by year he encroached further, taking farms, villages, and border towns. The Carthaginians protested to Rome. Rome ignored them. So finally, Carthage did what it was forbidden to do: it fought back a small war. A skirmish really, but to Rome, it was everything they needed. The pretext was perfect. Carthage has broken the treaty, they declared. Carthage must be punished. Cato's words became prophecy. The Roman Senate voted for the Third Punic War, and this time, they meant to end the story once and for all. When the Roman fleet appeared on the horizon in 149 BCE, Carthage was utterly unprepared. Its walls were strong, its people many, but its armies were gone, its weapons confiscated, its fleet destroyed. Still, the Carthaginians refused to surrender. Rome sent demands so cruel they were designed to break the spirit of any nation. Carthage must hand over all arms, all armor, and once disarmed, its people must abandon the city entirely and move 10 miles inland. The silence that followed was heavier than thunder. Abandon Carthage. Leave the city that had stood for 7 centuries, the city of Dido and Hannibal, of temples and harbors and gods. Never. And so, for the last time, Carthage prepared for war. Men, women, even children labored day and night. They melted down gold and silver for weapons. They stripped the city's temples of bronze to forge spears and catapults. Women cut their hair to make ropes for siege engines. The city that had once bought soldiers now became its own army. When the Romans landed, they expected surrender. What they found instead was fury. The first assault was driven back, the second crushed. From the walls, Carthaginian defenders rained fire and stones. The city's harbor rebuilt in secret released a handful of hastily armed ships that rammed Roman vessels in one desperate, glorious attack. But Rome was relentless. Their legions surrounded the city by land and sea. They built siege walls, towers, and trenches, cutting Carthage off from the world. Famine soon followed, the once prosperous streets filled with the smell of smoke and hunger. Yet the people would not yield. The siege dragged on for 3 long years. Every day brought fire, and every night the sound of hammers as the defenders rebuilt what the Romans destroyed. Among the attackers was Scipio Aemilianus, the adopted grandson of Scipio Africanus, the same bloodline that had defeated Hannibal. He was young, disciplined, and patient, unlike the generals who had failed before him. When he took command, the siege changed. He tightened the noose, cutting off every source of food and hope. Inside the city, despair turned to madness. People fought over scraps of leather and rat bones. Yet even then, they held the walls. It became more than war, it became faith. A belief that perhaps their gods would not allow Carthage to die. But in 146 BCE, that faith met its end. Scipio ordered the final assault. Roman legions stormed through the harbors, through burning streets, through temples that crumbled around them. House by house, room by room, the Carthaginians fought. Some hurled themselves from rooftops rather than be captured. Mothers killed their own children to spare them slavery. For 6 days, the fighting never stopped. The sky turned black with smoke. Flames rose so high that sailors at sea said it looked as if the sun had fallen into the earth when it was over. The city was a graveyard. 50,000 survivors out of hundreds of thousands were sold into slavery. The rest were dead. The Romans looted what remained, then turned to destruction. They tore down walls, temples, and houses until Carthage was nothing but ruins. According to legend, they salted the ground so nothing would grow again. Whether true or not, the gesture became a symbol, the attempt to erase Carthage not just from the map, but from memory, as Scipio Aemilianus watched the flames consume what had once been the greatest city of the Mediterranean. He wept. A witness recorded his words. A day will come when Rome too shall fall. It was not triumph he felt, but prophecy. Carthage was gone, yet its ashes carried something Rome could never destroy. The lesson that power built on domination breeds its own destruction. For centuries, the ruins of Carthage would stand by the sea, silent but unyielding, the wind whispering through its broken stones, like ghosts telling stories to the waves. But that was not quite the end, because from those ashes, something unexpected began to stir against something that would remind the world that even the dead can leave shadows that shape empires to come. The phoenix, they said, had burned. But could it rise once more? The eternal shadow. Carthage after Diad. Have you ever wondered what becomes of a city once it dies? Not the ashes, not the ruins, but the spirit, the echo that refuses to fade. Carthage should have vanished in 146 BCE. Its people scattered, its name cursed, and yet, somehow, it lived on not as a city of stone, but as an idea that haunted conquerors, philosophers, and kings for centuries. The flames had turned the skyline to dust, the once great harbors to rubble. The streets where Dido had walked, where Hannibal's name had been shouted in victory, lay silent. But memory, unlike marble, cannot be burned. The survivors, those 50,000 men, women, and children taken as slaves, carried that memory with them into Rome, into Greece, into every corner of the Mediterranean. They told stories of a city that had defied an empire, of courage that refused to kneel. Those whispers became legend. Rome thought it had erased Carthage. Instead, it had immortalized it. For a century, the land where Carthage had stood remained cursed ground. Roman law forbade anyone to rebuild upon it. Travelers said that at night, strange lights flickered over the ruins, as if the gods themselves mourned. Yet time, relentless as the tide, began to wash away the salt of hatred. The republic that had destroyed Carthage was itself changing, becoming richer, prouder, more fragile. Then came Julius Caesar. He stood among the ruins, his sandals crunching on ancient dust, and felt something stir. The man who dreamed of empire looked out over the empty bay and saw not a ghost, but potential. He ordered Carthage to be rebuilt as a Roman colony. And so, centuries after its annihilation, Carthago Nova was born. New Carthage rising where old Carthage had burned. Streets were paved again, villas rose, markets filled. Roman settlers came, but beneath their feet, the bones of the old city whispered still. The harbors were dredged, the temples rebuilt not to Baal or Tanit, but to Jupiter and Venus. Yet somehow, the city's spirit lingered, a silent reminder that the sea it once ruled had never forgotten its queen. Carthage thrived again, though under Roman banners this time. It became one of the largest cities in Africa, second only to Alexandria. Its new inhabitants traded in olive oil, grain, textiles, and glass. Roman governors ruled from its hilltops, senators sent their sons there to learn rhetoric, and its amphitheater echoed with the roars of crowds. But history, like the sea, never truly calms. When Rome itself began to fracture, the shadow of Carthage stirred once more in the 5th century CE. The Vandals, a Germanic tribe turned seafaring, power-swept across North Africa. They captured Carthage and made it their capital. The irony was impossible to miss. A new people, wild and fierce, ruling from the ashes of the old Phoenician city that had once terrorized Rome. The Vandals restored the old harbors, built fleets, and for a brief, shining moment, Carthage ruled the western Mediterranean again, not as Carthage, not as Rome, but as something reborn. They called it the Empire of the Sea, echoing the words that had once described Dito's descendants. The Mediterranean trembled once more under the sails of a power that rose from the same coast. But empires built on conquest seldom last. The Byzantine Emperor Justinian sent his general Belisarius to reclaim the lost provinces. And in 533 CE, after a lightning campaign, Carthage fell again, this time to the east. The Byzantines rebuilt what they could, but the city's heart was tired. The marble cracked, the harbors silted. Centuries passed. Then, like a shadow, returning to reclaim what was once its own, came the Arabs in 698 CE. The city was taken and burned once more, its stones stripped to build a new capital nearby, Tunis. And from that moment on, Carthage truly vanished from the living world. Its name faded from maps, its ruins buried under earth and time. Only poets and scholars remembered it, a ghost city beneath the desert wind. Yet its influence never died. The Romans who destroyed it inherited its genius for trade, its naval craft, its urban design. The harbors of Rome's empire were modeled after Carthage's circular docks. Roman merchants learned the art of contracts and currency from their former enemies. Even the Roman word, Punic, once an insult, became shorthand for cunia, grudging tribute to Carthaginian intelligence and in spirit. Carthage lived on in something deeper, the eternal rivalry of power and fear. Rome could not tolerate Carthage because it mirrored Rome itself, ambitious, proud, unyielding. Every empire since has carried that same paradox, the dread of the rival, who reflects your own soul too perfectly. When historians look back, they see two civilizations locked in a tragic symmetry: Carthage the merchant, the sea queen, the innovator, and Rome, the soldier, the lawgiver, the conqueror. Each needed the other to define itself. Without Carthage, Rome might have remained a regional power. It was Carthage that taught Rome what it meant to rule the Mediterranean. It was Carthage that forced Rome to evolve, to harden, to become the empire we remember. And so, in a way, Carthage did not lose. It transformed its enemy. Its destruction became the seed of something larger, something both magnificent and monstrous. Even centuries later, when European explorers sailed into the Atlantic, they carried with them the same restless hunger that had driven Carthaginian mariners to the edge of the known world. Some even whispered that the Carthaginians had reached the Canary Islands or perhaps farther still long before any Roman ship dared. Today, the ruins of Carthage still lie near Tunis. Tourists walk among shattered columns and broken mosaics, unaware that beneath their feet lie 3 layers of civilization, Roman and Byzantine, fused by fire. The sea that once reflected fleets now laps quietly at the stones, carrying secrets too old to tell. If you stand there at sunset, the air smells of salt and memory. The waves break softly against the old harbor, as if whispering names to Dido, Hamilcar, Hannibal, Scipio. You can almost hear the echo of drums from another age, the cry of oarsmen, the whisper of sails. The wind seems to murmur the same question that has haunted history for over 2,000 years. Can greatness ever truly devour? Does it merely change its shape? Carthage's story answers that question in silence, because even in ruin, it endures in our words, our maps, our empires, our imagination. The city that once traded across the world still trades across time. And as long as people tell its story, as long as we wonder how a city of traders defied the might of Rome, Carthage will live. Its ashes have long cooled, but its shadow still stretches across the Mediterranean, eternal as the tide.